You sleep outside with the animals where you belong. That was the last thing my father said to me 15 years ago, as he chained me to a rotting doghouse in a thunderstorm. I shivered in the mud while he ate a steak dinner inside with his new family. Today, I bought his company, his mansion, and the very ground he stands on. When he tried to kick me off his property, I just smiled and handed him an eviction notice. But before we get to the sweet revenge, let me tell you how it all started. My name is Ethan Cole, and at 34 years old, I am known as the Shark of Wall Street. I specialize in distressed debt and hostile takeovers. To the world, I am a predator, but to the man standing in the center of the Plaza Hotel ballroom, I was nothing more than a ghost. I adjusted my $10,000 bespoke suit and checked my Patek Philippe watch. It was time. I walked through the gilded doors of the hotel, ready to face the family that threw me away like garbage. If you are watching this from a place where family loyalty was a one-way street, let me know in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. The air inside the ballroom smelled of expensive perfume and desperation. It was the 35th anniversary gala of Cole Real Estate, and my father, Richard Cole, was sweating through his tuxedo. From where I stood near the entrance, I could see him frantically checking his phone. His investors were pulling out, his empire was crumbling, but he did not know that I was the one pulling the loose threads. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for someone to blame for his anxiety. Then his gaze landed on me. He did not see his son. He did not see the boy he abandoned. He only saw a young man standing near the door and assumed I was the help. He marched over to me, his face red with stress and arrogance. Without even looking me in the eye, he pulled a set of heavy car keys from his pocket and threw them hard against my chest. I caught them instinctively. The metal was cold against my palm. "Hey you!" he barked loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "You must be the new valet. Park the black Bentley out front and do not scratch it. If there is a single mark on that car, you will have to sell your house to pay for it." He turned his back on me, immediately dismissing me as beneath his notice. He thought I was there to serve him just like before. He had no idea that the keys in my hand were not for his car, but for his destruction. I looked at the keys and then at his retreating back. I was not going to park his car. I was going to crash his party. The jagged metal edges of the car keys dug into my palm, cutting through the present moment like a serrated knife. That cold sensation was all it took to drag me back to the night my soul froze over. The sounds of the gala faded away, replaced by the deafening roar of a thunderstorm that tore through the estate 15 years ago. I was 17 again, helpless and terrified, being dragged by the collar of my shirt across the pristine marble floor. My father's grip was iron tight, his knuckles white with rage. "You clumsy, useless waste of space." His voice boomed over the thunder, shaking the walls of the hallway. "That vase was from the Ming Dynasty. It was worth more than your entire existence." I tried to dig my heels into the floor to stop him screaming that I did not do it. I begged him to believe me that it was Preston who had knocked it over while playing indoor baseball. But Richard Cole did not care about the truth. He only cared that his precious antique was shattered, and he needed someone to punish. He threw open the heavy oak back door, and the storm hit me instantly, soaking my clothes and chilling me to the bone. He did not stop at the patio. He dragged me out into the mud, the rain blinding me until we reached the far corner of the yard. There it stood. The rotting wooden doghouse that had been empty since our German shepherd died. The smell of wet wood and decay filled my nose as he shoved me down into the filth. I tried to stand up, but he kicked my legs out from under me. Then came the sound that haunts my nightmares. The click of a heavy padlock. He wrapped a rusted iron chain around my ankle and secured it to the stake in the ground. "If you want to act like a destructive animal, you will live like one." He spat the words at me, wiping the rain from his face. "No dinner. No bed. You stay here until you learn the value of my property." I watched through the downpour as he walked back to the warmth of the mansion. The golden light spilled out from the living room window, casting a long shadow on the wet grass. And there she was, Patricia. She stood behind the glass, holding a glass of warm red wine, dry and comfortable. She saw me shivering in the mud, the chain cutting into my ankle. For a second, I thought she might show mercy. I thought she might be the mother figure I desperately needed. Instead, she locked eyes with me and slowly lifted the corners of her mouth in a satisfied smirk. It was a smile of pure malice, a victory lap, without saying a word. She reached up and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, extinguishing the light and leaving me in total darkness. The memory faded as quickly as it had come. The thunder was replaced by the polite murmur of the crowd, and the smell of rain was gone, masked by expensive cologne. I looked down at the keys in my hand. My grip was so tight my knuckles were white. The pain in my palm was grounding. It reminded me that the shivering boy in the mud was gone. The man standing here now was not a victim. He was the storm. I did not turn toward the door. Instead, I locked eyes with the man who had tormented my childhood and tossed the keys back at him. It was not a violent throw, just a dismissive underhand toss, but it hit him square in the chest with a satisfying thud before clattering onto the polished marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot, instantly freezing the chatter of 300 guests. Everyone stopped mid-sip, staring at the valet who had just disrespected the host. Richard looked down at the keys and then up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was not used to defiance, especially not from someone he considered beneath him. I stepped closer into his personal space, my voice calm but loud enough to carry over the ambient jazz music. "Park it yourself, Richard. And honestly, I would not worry too much about preserving the paint job. The bank is scheduled to repossess that Bentley in 48 hours anyway, so there is no point in polishing a corpse." The color drained from his face, only to be replaced by a deep shade of violet rage. The mention of the repossession struck a nerve, exposing the financial rot he had been desperately trying to hide from his investors. He clenched his fists, his body trembling with the urge to strike me, just as he had done so many times when I was a boy. He took a menacing step forward, raising his hand to backhand me in front of the city elite. He forgot that I was no longer a skinny teenager he could bully. I stood my ground, not flinching a muscle, daring him to do it. I almost wanted him to. "Dad, stop." A voice cut through the tension coming from the VIP section. I turned to see Preston strutting toward us, holding a glass of champagne like a scepter. My half-brother looked exactly as I expected, soft, doughy, and expensive. He was wearing a white tuxedo that screamed new money, and clinging to his arm was a stunning African-American woman with sharp, intelligent eyes. That had to be Keisha. While Preston looked oblivious and arrogant, she was scanning the scene, assessing the threat level like a lawyer preparing for court. Preston stepped between us, shielding his father not out of bravery, but out of habit. He looked me up and down, his nose wrinkling as if he smelled something foul. He was about to call security when he paused. He tilted his head, looking past the expensive suit, and seeing the ghost of the brother he used to torment. His eyes went wide and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Wait a minute." He laughed, a sound that was half disbelief and half mockery. "Is that Ethan?" The shock on Preston's face vanished instantly, replaced by a sneer of pure amusement. He threw his head back and laughed, a loud, grating sound that drew the attention of every wealthy patron in the vicinity. He looked at me, not with the eyes of a brother, but with the disgust one might reserve for a stray animal that had wandered into a sterile hospital. "Well, look who finally crawled out of the gutter," Preston announced, his voice booming through the hall. "The mange dog has returned home." "What is the matter, Ethan? Did you run out of trash cans to raid? I honestly thought you had died of an overdose under a bridge somewhere years ago." He turned to the crowd, gesturing at me like I was a circus freak. "Can you believe this, ladies and gentlemen? The prodigal son returns, but he forgot to wipe the filth off his shoes before entering civilized society." I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I simply stood there, letting his insults hang in the air like bad perfume. My silence seemed to irritate him. Preston was used to getting a reaction. He was used to me begging or crying or fighting back so he could play the victim. When I gave him nothing, he decided to escalate. He swirled the expensive vintage Cabernet in his crystal flute, his eyes locking onto my chest. "You are probably here for money, right?" Preston sneered, stepping closer until I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "That is always the story with people like you. You fail at life and then you come crawling back to Daddy hoping for a handout. Well, let me save you the trouble, Ethan. The charity window is closed." Before I could respond, he tipped his glass forward. It was a calculated move, slow and deliberate. The dark red liquid splashed onto the lapel of my custom-made suit, soaking into the dark fabric, and dripping down onto my crisp white shirt. The guests gasped audibly. It was a gesture of ultimate disrespect, a public marking of territory. The wine was cold, but my blood was boiling hot. "Oops," Preston said with a mock pout that made his face look punchable. My hand slipped. "But honestly, Ethan, that suit looks like a cheap knockoff anyway. I probably just increased its value." He turned away from me, snapping his fingers in the air to summon the uniformed men standing by the entrance. "Security," he yelled, his voice dripping with entitlement. "Get this beggar out of here immediately. He is harassing the guests and smelling up the room. I want him thrown out on the sidewalk where he belongs. Do not let him back in unless he has a shovel to clean up the dog waste." Two large security guards started moving toward us, their hands reaching for their radios. Richard stood behind Preston, crossing his arms and nodding in approval, clearly enjoying the show. They thought they were taking out the trash. They did not realize they were handling a bomb that was already ticking down to zero. I brushed a drop of wine from my sleeve and prepared for my exit, knowing that the stain on my shirt was nothing compared to the stain I was about to leave on their reputation. While the rest of the room chuckled at Preston's cruel performance, there was one person who remained deadly silent. Keisha stood frozen at my brother's side, her hand clutching his arm a little too tightly. Unlike the other guests who saw only a humiliated servant, Keisha was looking at the details. She was a corporate attorney, a woman who made her living reading the fine print and spotting lies. Right now her eyes were locked on my chest, but not at the wine stain. She was studying the fabric. She watched how the vintage Cabernet did not immediately soak into the fibers, but beaded up slightly on the surface. She knew that texture. It was vicuna wool, the kind of fabric that cost more per yard than most people earned in a month. Her gaze traveled down to my wrists, which were exposed as I brushed the liquid away. That was when I saw her breath hitch in her throat. She had spotted the cufflinks. They were platinum skulls encrusted with rare black diamonds, a limited edition piece from a designer in Zurich that required a 6-month waiting list. Keisha knew exactly what they were because she had tried to buy a pair for Preston as a wedding gift, only to be laughed out of the store when she saw the price tag. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The man standing in front of her was not wearing a costume. He was wearing a fortune. She leaned in close to Preston, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper that only the three of us could hear. "Preston, stop it right now," she hissed, digging her manicured nails into his white tuxedo jacket. "Look at his wrist. Look at the cut of that jacket. That suit is bespoke Savile Row. It is not off the rack. And those cufflinks cost more than our entire wedding reception combined. You need to back off. We are making a mistake." Preston paused for a second, blinking in confusion before his arrogance came rushing back. He pulled his arm away from her grip and rolled his eyes, letting out a dismissive snort. He looked at me with the same blind contempt he had held for 15 years, refusing to see the reality right in front of his face. "You are being paranoid, babe," he laughed, shaking his head. "It is a rental, or a cheap knockoff he picked up in Chinatown to look important. Look at him, Keisha. It is Ethan. The guy ate dog food. He does not have 2 dimes to rub together. He is probably parking cars just to pay for the dry cleaning of that fake suit." Keisha did not look convinced. She looked terrified. She looked back at me, and for a brief second our eyes met. In that moment she saw something that Preston missed. She saw that I was not embarrassed. She saw that I was not angry. She saw that I was waiting. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging her sharp eye. She swallowed hard, realizing that her husband had just kicked a hornet nest, and she was the only one who could hear the buzzing. Preston turned back to the security guards, waving his hand impatiently, oblivious to the fact that the predator in the room was not the one being escorted out. The security guards moved in their heavy hands, landing on my shoulders with the weight of borrowed authority. I did not struggle. I did not lash out. There was no dignity in fighting men who were simply following orders, even if those orders came from a fool. I simply shrugged them off with a sharp, calculated roll of my shoulders, a silent command that said, "Do not touch me." They hesitated, sensing an authority that did not match my brother's description of a beggar. I took a moment to smooth the lapel of my wine-stained jacket, flicking a drop of the expensive Cabernet onto the plush hotel carpet. I turned my gaze to Richard one last time. He was still red-faced, chest-heaving, looking every bit the tyrant whose reign was ending. The room was deadly silent, 300 pairs of eyes darting between the father who had cast me out and the son who had returned. I spoke clearly, my voice steady and devoid of the anger they expected. "Enjoy the party, Richard. Drink the good wine and laugh with your investors tonight, because this is the last time you will ever stand in this room as the host." I did not wait for his response. I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, the sea of guests parting for me like I was Moses. I could feel their eyes on my back, a mixture of confusion and pity. They thought I was walking out into the cold, back to the gutter my brother claimed I lived in. They were wrong. The night air outside the plaza was crisp and biting. The valet stand was chaotic with luxury cars lined up and guests waiting for their vehicles. But as I stepped onto the curb, the chaos seemed to pause. A vehicle glided through the line of traffic like a shark through water, parting the sea of yellow taxis and standard limousines. It was not just a car, it was a statement. A midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom, the kind of machine that commanded silence just by existing. It pulled up right in front of me, its massive grille gleaming under the hotel lights. The crowd on the steps, including my father and brother who had followed me out to gloat, fell dead silent. The driver's side door opened. A man in an impeccable uniform stepped out. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Preston. He walked straight to me, bypassing the actual valet staff. "Good evening, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice respectful and practiced. He opened the rear suicide door with a gloved hand, revealing an interior of cream leather and walnut wood. "I have the acquisition papers ready for your signature in the back. The board is waiting for your confirmation." I paused before getting in, looking back at the trio standing in the hotel entrance. Richard looked like he had seen a ghost. Preston's mouth was hanging open, his earlier laughter dying in his throat. I slid into the hand-stitched leather interior, the smell of success replacing the stench of their judgment. As the heavy door clicked shut, sealing me in my own private world, I pressed the button to lower the tinted window just an inch. I heard Preston's voice, high-pitched and frantic, trying to salvage his bruised ego. "It is a rental," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the car as if to cast a spell that would make it disappear. He probably blew his entire life savings to rent it for an hour just to make a scene. "It is a trick, Dad. He is trying to psych us out." Richard nodded rapidly, desperate to believe the lie. "Pathetic," my father muttered, though his eyes were wide with a fear he could not hide. Spending money he does not have to impress people who do not care. Just like his mother. Only Keisha remained silent. She watched the Spirit of Ecstasy hood ornament gleaming under the streetlights. She noticed the custom diplomatic plate, something you could not get on a rental. She knew. As my driver pulled away, merging smoothly into the New York traffic, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the center console. The first battle was over. The war had just begun. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Cole estate, casting long shadows across the breakfast table. Richard sat at the head of the table, picking at his eggs Benedict. He looked tired. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night spent worrying about stock prices and the humiliation at the Plaza Hotel. He was trying to convince himself that the encounter with me was just a hallucination or a bad prank. He told himself that I was powerless and that he was still the king of his castle. The silence was broken by the heavy footsteps of the family housekeeper. She walked into the room holding a thick envelope with both hands as if it were an explosive device. She placed it next to Richard's coffee cup and backed away quickly. The envelope was not the usual cream-colored stationery from his country club. It was stark white with a red stamp that read, "Certified Mail Urgent." Richard picked up his silver letter opener and slit the top of the envelope. He expected a fine for the scene caused at the hotel, or perhaps a letter from an angry investor. He pulled out the stack of documents. The letterhead at the top did not belong to his usual bank. Instead of the friendly blue logo of his traditional lender, there was a black silhouette of a three-headed dog. The name printed in bold capital letters was Cerberus Capital. He frowned. He had never heard of this firm. He began to read, and with every line the blood drained further from his face. The letter was a notice of debt assignment. His bank, realizing that Cole Real Estate was sinking, had sold his bad debt to a private equity firm to cut their losses. But Cerberus Capital was not interested in collecting monthly interest payments. Richard's eyes scanned down to the paragraph highlighted in yellow. It cited a violation of the liquidity covenant in his original loan agreement. Because his company stock had dipped below a certain threshold, the lender had the right to demand full repayment immediately. The numbers swam before his eyes. The mortgage on the mansion where he sat. The mortgage on the downtown office tower that housed his legacy. The total outstanding balance was $15 million. He read the next line out loud, his voice trembling. Immediate recall of principal and interest. Failure to remit payment in full within 48 hours will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings and seizure of all collateral. 48 hours. 2 days to find $15 million. He dropped the paper. It fluttered down onto his plate, landing in the egg yolk. The mansion walls suddenly felt like they were closing in on him. He looked around the room at the expensive art and the imported furniture, realizing that technically none of it belonged to him anymore. It belonged to the three-headed dog. And the dog was hungry. The sound of a crystal vase smashing against the marble fireplace signaled the end of the morning calm. Patricia was pacing around the living room like a caged animal, her face twisted in a mask of pure terror. She was not worried about my father going to jail or the employees losing their jobs. She was terrified of losing her status. She grabbed Richard by the lapels of his silk robe, shaking him violently. "Fix this, Richard," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Fix this right now. I am not moving into a condo. I will not be the laughingstock of the country club. Do you hear me? Call someone. Get the money." Richard pushed her away, his hands shaking as he dialed number after number on his phone. He called his golf buddies, his business partners, and even the rivals he had once looked down upon. He needed a lifeline. He needed a bridge loan. He needed a miracle. But the response was always the same: silence or a dial tone. The rumor mill in New York moves faster than light, and somehow everyone already knew that Cole Real Estate was a sinking ship. "I am sorry, Richard," said his oldest friend George before hanging up abruptly. "But I heard the audit reports. I saw the memo about the liquidity crisis. You are toxic assets now. I cannot be seen lending to you. Good luck." Richard dropped the phone onto the sofa, looking defeated. "Someone leaked the financials," he whispered, his face pale. "Someone told the street we are insolvent." He did not know that the leak came from the very predator circling his house. He did not know that I had sent those memos myself just before buying his debt. That was when the sharks started eating each other. Preston, who had been sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone, suddenly threw it across the room. It bounced off the wall and cracked, but he did not care. "You old fool," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at his father. "You told me the company was bulletproof. You told me my trust fund was secure. How could you be so stupid to lose everything? What am I supposed to do now? I have gambling debts, Richard. I have people coming for me." Richard snapped. The stress of the last 24 hours finally broke him. The veins in his neck bulged as he turned on his golden child, the son he had protected and spoiled for decades. "Do not you dare speak to me like that," Richard roared. "If you had spent half as much time learning the business as you did betting on horses in Vegas, maybe we would not be in this mess. You are 30 years old and you have never worked a day in your life. And you—" Richard spun around to face Patricia, who was sobbing dry tears into a silk handkerchief. "You spent $3 million on renovations last year alone. You drained the emergency fund for your jewelry and your vacations to the French Riviera. You bled me dry, Patricia. You are the reason we have no cash reserves." The living room turned into a war zone of accusations. They were tearing each other apart just as I knew they would. Desperation strips away the veneer of civility, leaving only the ugly truth underneath. While they screamed and fought over who was to blame, I was sitting in my office 10 miles away, watching the stock price of Cole Real Estate hit zero. The trap was set. Now it was time to close the cage. The headquarters of Cerberus Capital was not designed to welcome guests. It was a fortress of black glass and steel that pierced the Manhattan skyline, standing apart from the older, warmer buildings of the financial district. When Richard Preston and Keisha arrived at 9 in the morning, they walked into a lobby that felt more like a mausoleum than a place of business. The air conditioning was cranked down to a bone-chilling 60 degrees, a deliberate setting I had requested specifically for their arrival. Richard approached the reception desk, trying to summon the authority he no longer possessed. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, expecting the young woman behind the marble counter to jump to attention. She did not even look up from her screen. "I am Richard Cole," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "I am here to see the managing partner. It is urgent regarding the debt assignment." The receptionist continued typing for 10 agonizing seconds before slowly lifting her eyes. Her expression was bored, almost robotic. "Name?" she asked, as if he had not just said it. When he repeated it, she simply pointed to a row of uncomfortable minimalist chairs against the far wall. "Sit. Someone will be with you shortly." They sat. And they waited. This was the first phase of the negotiation, and it had nothing to do with money. It was about power. I watched them from the security feed in my office 40 floors above. For the first hour, they were annoyed. Preston sat with his legs crossed, aggressively checking his watch every 2 minutes and muttering about how he would have this receptionist fired. Richard paced back and forth, making frantic phone calls that went straight to voicemail. By the second hour, the annoyance turned into physical discomfort. The cold air was relentless. Preston, who was wearing a lightweight linen suit, suitable for a summer gala, began to shiver visibly. He walked back to the desk and demanded a bottle of water. The receptionist simply pointed to a small plaque on the counter. "No food or beverages in the waiting area." "But we have been here for 2 hours," Preston snapped, his voice rising. "This is illegal. You cannot treat us like this. Do you know who my father is?" The receptionist did not blink. "If you continue to raise your voice, security will escort you out, and your meeting will be cancelled. Sit down, sir." Preston retreated, defeated and shivering. By the third hour, the silence and the cold had broken them. Richard was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw fear of a man who knows the executioner is sharpening the axe. Keisha sat perfectly still, clutching her briefcase to her chest for warmth. She was the only one analyzing the situation correctly. She looked at the locked double doors made of frosted glass, and then at the receptionist, who was clearly following strict orders. "They are not busy," she whispered to Richard, her teeth chattering slightly. "This is not a delay. This is a tactic. They are freezing us out, literally. They want us desperate before we even walk through those doors." Just as Richard was about to lose his composure completely, a loud buzzer sounded. The magnetic locks on the double doors disengaged with a heavy clank. The receptionist finally looked up with a thin, cruel smile. "The partners will see you now. Go all the way to the end of the hall." The double doors swung open with a heavy hydraulic hiss, revealing a conference room that looked more like a war room than a place for business. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling screens, displaying real-time market data, and the center of the room was dominated by a massive table made of black obsidian. It was designed to make anyone sitting on the other side feel small, and that is exactly how Richard Preston and Keisha felt as they stepped onto the plush carpet. At the far end of the table, a high-backed leather executive chair was facing the window, looking out over the sprawling Manhattan skyline. The person sitting in it remained hidden, a silhouette against the bright morning light. The air in the room was thick with tension. Richard tried to regain his composure, adjusting his tie and stepping forward with a forced smile. "Good morning," he boomed, trying to project confidence he did not feel. "I am Richard Cole. I assume you are the managing partner of Cerberus. We are here to discuss a misunderstanding regarding my company debt." The figure in the chair did not move. There was a long, agonizing silence. Richard exchanged a nervous glance with Preston, who was already sweating again despite the room being temperature-controlled. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice faltering slightly. "I am speaking to you. It is incredibly rude to turn your back on a guest." Slowly, smoothly, the chair began to swivel. It turned with a mechanical precision that felt calculated. As the face of the man in the chair came into view, Richard's jaw dropped. He blinked rapidly, expecting the image to shift, expecting it to be anyone else in the world. But it was not anyone else. Sitting there in a suit that cost more than Richard's car was me. I looked at them with eyes that held zero warmth. My hands were steeped together on the desk, resting on top of a thick legal file. "You," Richard stammered, his face turning a blotchy red. "The valet from the hotel." "What the hell are you doing here? Get out of that chair immediately." He turned to look for security, expecting them to rush in and tackle me. But the guards stood stone-faced at the door, their arms crossed. They were my guards. Richard looked back at me, his brain unable to process the reality. "Did you break in here?" he shouted, pointing a shaking finger. "You are insane! You are going to prison for this! Get up before I call the police! You are nothing but a servant!" I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply picked up the thick file in front of me, the one stamped with the Cerberus logo and the foreclosure notice. I tossed it across the obsidian table. It slid perfectly, stopping right at Richard's fingertips. The thud of the paper hitting the table echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block. "I am not the valet, Richard," I said, my voice calm and deadly, "and I am not your son. Not anymore." I leaned forward, the light catching the black diamonds on my cuffs. "I am Cerberus. I am the one who bought your debt. I am the one who owns your mortgage, your company, and as of this morning, your future." I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the color drain from all three of their faces. "Welcome to hell." The silence in the conference room was so heavy it felt like it could crush lungs. Richard stared at the file in front of him, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the foreclosure notice. He looked up at me, searching for a trace of the terrified teenager he had once bullied, but all he found was a wall of indifference. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my legs comfortably, while they sat stiffly on the edge of their seats. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air in the room seemed to vibrate. "Do you remember the rules of your house, Richard?" I asked, my voice soft but echoing off the glass walls. "You had very specific policies about who was allowed inside and who had to stay out in the cold. I remember one night in particular. It was raining. You dragged me by the collar and told me that the house is for humans and the dog sleeps outside with the animals." Richard flinched. He remembered. Of course he remembered. It was the night he broke my spirit, or at least tried to. "Well, let us apply that logic to our current situation." I continued, tapping my finger on the obsidian desk. "According to the deed in front of you, I own this building. I own the mortgage on your mansion. I own the debt on your company. Essentially, I own the roof over your head. In this scenario, I am the human. I am the master of the house. So tell me, Richard, if I am the human, what does that make you?" Preston slammed his hand on the table, his face turning a blotchy red. "Do not talk to him like that. He is your father. You are sick, Ethan. You are just a bitter loser playing make-believe." I did not even look at Preston. I kept my eyes locked on Richard. "I do not like the way you are sitting," I said calmly. "It implies equality, and we are not equals. Not anymore. Stand up." Richard's eyes widened. "Excuse me," he sputtered. "You heard me. Stand up when you speak to me. I am your father." Richard hissed, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and humiliation. "I will not be ordered around like a schoolboy by my own son." "Then the meeting is over." I reached for the phone on the desk. "I will call legal and have them execute the foreclosure immediately. You can pack your bags by noon." My hand hovered over the receiver. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. I knew Richard's pride was his weakness, but his greed was his master. He looked at the phone, then at the foreclosure notice, then at me. The war inside his head was visible on his face. He was weighing his dignity against his lifestyle. Slowly, painfully, Richard pushed his chair back. The scraping sound was agonizingly loud in the quiet room. He placed his hands on the table to steady himself and rose to his feet. He stood there towering over the table physically, but looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed slightly. For the first time in his life, Richard Cole was standing because I told him to. I looked at Preston and Keisha. "You too," I said simply. Keisha stood up immediately, understanding the game. Preston hesitated, looking at his father for support, but finding none, he scrambled to his feet. There they stood, three people who had looked down on me their entire lives, now standing at attention, waiting for my permission to breathe. It was a petty victory, I admit. But after 15 years of sleeping in the mud, watching them squirm felt like justice. With the men in the room effectively neutralized, it was Patricia's turn to play her hand. I watched her carefully as she smoothed the fabric of her designer dress, taking a deep, steadying breath. She was a former runway model, and she knew exactly how to use her appearance to manipulate a situation. She saw that Richard's aggression had failed, and Preston's entitlement had backfired. So she decided to use the weapon she had wielded against my father for decades: emotional manipulation. She took a step toward the obsidian table, her posture softening instantly. Gone was the screeching harpy who had demanded a renovation budget. In her place stood a fragile, grieving mother figure. Her eyes, which had been hard as flint seconds ago, suddenly shimmered with unshed tears. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Ethan, darling, please. Look at us. We are not enemies. We are family." She walked around the side of the table, ignoring Richard's confused glare. She moved with a slow, non-threatening grace, trying to close the physical distance between us. "I know you are angry," she continued, her voice gaining a husky, sincere quality. "And you have every right to be. The past? It was complicated. Your father was under so much pressure back then, and I was young and unsure of my place. But there was never a day that went by that I did not think of you." I remained silent, my face a mask of indifference. I wanted to see how far she would go. I wanted to see if she would choke on the lies. "We missed you, Ethan," she said, daring to come closer. "When you left, it broke our hearts. We looked for you. Did you know that? We tried to find you, but you had covered your tracks so well. We thought we had lost you forever." She was now standing right next to my chair. The scent of her expensive perfume, purely floral with an undertone of musk, filled my personal space. It was the same perfume she wore the day she watched me get chained in the yard. It triggered a wave of nausea in my stomach, but I forced myself to sit still. She reached out her hand, her manicured fingers aiming for my arm. It was a calculated move, a motherly touch, a connection designed to bridge the gap and remind me of a bond that never existed. "Ethan, please let us start over." Her fingertips were inches from my sleeve. "Do not touch me." The command left my mouth like a whip crack. I pulled my arm away sharply, swiveling my chair so fast that she stumbled back in surprise. It was not just a rejection, it was a recoil. I looked at her hand as if it were covered in leprosy. "Do not rewrite history, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. "You did not look for me. You changed the locks the day I left. I know because I came back a week later to get my birth certificate and my key did not work. I saw you through the window. You were redecorating my room. You turned it into a walk-in closet for your shoe collection." Patricia's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the panic underneath. "And do not insult my intelligence by pretending you missed me." I continued, standing up slowly to tower over her. "You did not miss me. You missed having a punching bag. And now that the punching bag is sitting in the chairman's seat, you do not see a son. You see a lifeline. You see an ATM machine that can save your social status." I walked around the table, putting distance between us, not because I was afraid of her, but because being near her made my skin crawl. "You can act like the grieving mother all you want," I said, turning back to face them. "But we both know the truth. You are not sorry you treated me like a dog. You are just sorry that the dog is now the one holding the leash." The room fell silent again. Patricia stood frozen, her hands still hovering in midair, rejected and exposed. She looked at Richard, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She realized that her charm, her beauty, and her tears had absolutely no currency here. Her account was overdrawn. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. I did not just keep my memories, Patricia. I kept receipts. You see, when you live in a house where you are constantly under attack, you learn to document everything. I was 17 years old and terrified, but I was smart enough to hit the record button on my old MP3 player whenever you started screaming. I tapped the screen, connecting the device to the conference room surround sound system. The speakers were state-of-the-art, designed to deliver crystal-clear audio for billion-dollar presentations. Today, they were going to deliver a blast from the past. "Let us take a trip down memory lane," I said, my finger hovering over the play button. This file was recorded on November 12, 2009, the night of the storm. I pressed play. A burst of digital static filled the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of rain pounding against a window. Then a voice cut through the noise. It was higher pitched, sharper, and dripping with venom, but there was no mistaking who it belonged to. "Richard, get that mongrel out of my kitchen right now." The recording of Patricia screamed, her voice distorted by rage. "Watching him eat makes me want to vomit. He is shoving food into his mouth like an animal. Why are we feeding him? That steak costs $20 a pound. Save it for Preston. Preston is a growing boy who needs protein. Ethan is just a waste of space. Put him in the yard where he belongs. If I see him at this table one more time, I will throw the plate at his head." The audio clip ended with the sound of a heavy door slamming shut. The silence that followed was louder than the recording itself. The air conditioning hummed softly, but nobody moved. Patricia stood frozen, her face draining of color until she looked like a wax statue melting under heat. Her mouth hung open slightly, but the sweet mother act had evaporated completely. She looked at Richard, but he was staring at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Even Preston looked uncomfortable, shifting in his shoes as he realized that his steak dinners had come at the cost of my starvation. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my fingers over my chest. The contrast between the loving mother she just pretended to be and the monster on the tape was absolute. There was no spinning this. There was no misunderstanding. It was pure, unadulterated hatred broadcast in high definition. "You were saying something about love," I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You were talking about how much you missed me and how we are family. Please, Patricia, do not stop on my account. Go on. I am listening." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly. A single bead of sweat rolled down her temple, ruining her perfect makeup. She took a half step back, retreating from me as if I were the one holding a weapon. In a way, I was. The truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. The recording ended, but the echo of Patricia's hatred seemed to hang in the air like smoke. I placed my phone back on the desk, face down. The room was theirs again, but the dynamic had shifted permanently. They looked at me with a mixture of fear and confusion, waiting for the final blow. I decided to give them a lifeline, or rather a noose long enough to hang themselves. "I am willing to offer you a stay of execution," I said, leaning back in my leather chair and tenting my fingers. "I will hold off on the foreclosure for exactly 30 days. That gives you 1 month to find new investors, sell off assets, or refinance the debt." Richard's head snapped up. Hope flared in his eyes. 30 days. He could work with that. He opened his mouth to accept, to thank me, but I held up a hand. "There is a condition, a price that must be paid up front, and it has nothing to do with money." I turned my gaze to Preston. He was currently trying to make himself invisible, shrinking into his chair. When he felt my eyes on him, he stiffened. "The price is Preston," I said calmly. Preston blinked. "Me? What do you want from me?" "I do not have any money." "I do not want your money, Preston. I want your freedom. I want you to walk out of this building, go straight to the 19th precinct, and turn yourself in for the hit and run that occurred on September 4th, 2009. The color drained from Preston's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He shot up from his chair, knocking it backward. It crashed against the glass wall with a deafening bang. "Are you insane?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "That was 15 years ago. The statute of limitations is probably up. You cannot ask me to do that." I remained perfectly still. "There is no statute of limitations on vehicular manslaughter involving a minor, Preston. You know that. And I know that." Preston was hyperventilating now. He looked at his father, then at his wife, then back at me. Panic had short-circuited his brain. He was not thinking like a lawyer or a businessman. He was thinking like a guilty child who was terrified of the dark. "No," he shouted, slamming his hands on the table. "No way. That case is closed. It is done. You took the fall. You confessed. You spent time in juvenile detention so I would not have to. You cannot drag this up again. It is double jeopardy or something." The room went deadly silent. Preston froze, realizing too late what he had just screamed. He slowly turned his head toward Keisha. His wife, the brilliant attorney, was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. She had known her husband was spoiled. She had known he was entitled. But she had not known he was a criminal who let his brother go to prison for his crime. "I took the fall because I had no choice," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "But I am not a 17-year-old boy anymore, and I am done paying for your sins. You have 24 hours to surrender Preston, or I take the house." The air in the boardroom grew heavy as the weight of the past suffocated the present. I watched Preston trembling in his seat, and for a moment I was not seeing a 30-year-old man in a designer suit. I was seeing the 15-year-old boy shivering on the curb next to a twisted heap of metal and shattered glass. Let us remind everyone exactly how that night went down. It was 2 in the morning when Richard kicked open the door to my room. He did not wake me up to tell me there had been an accident. He woke me up because he needed a scapegoat. He dragged me out of bed and shoved me into the back of the town car, driving like a maniac to the corner of 4th and Main. The scene was a disaster. The front of the family Porsche was wrapped around the entrance of a local grocery store. Steam was rising from the crushed radiator, mixing with the smoke. And there was Preston sitting on the asphalt, crying his eyes out without a scratch on him. He had been drag racing. He had lost control. And he had fled the scene before realizing he could not hide a wrecked sports car. I stood there in my pajamas, confused and terrified, asking if anyone was hurt. But Richard did not care about the shop owner or the damage. He grabbed me by the shoulders, his fingers digging into my flesh with a bruising force. The sirens were wailing in the distance, getting louder with every second. The red and blue lights were already reflecting off the broken store windows. "Listen to me, Ethan," Richard had hissed, his face inches from mine. "The police will be here in 30 seconds. When they ask who was driving, you are going to tell them it was you. You took the keys without asking. You lost control. You are going to take the fall." I tried to pull away. I told him no. I told him I had been asleep. I pleaded with him not to do this to me. But he tightened his grip, shaking me until my teeth rattled. "Look at your brother," he spat, pointing at the sobbing mess that was Preston. "He has a future. He is going to Yale. He is going to take over the company. One mark on his record and his life is over. But you, Ethan, look at you. You are illegitimate. You are a mistake. You do not have a reputation to protect because you are nobody. Your future does not matter. His does." Those words hit me harder than the car had hit that wall. My own father was looking me in the eye and telling me that my life was disposable. He was weighing his sons on a scale, and I was lighter than air. He was not asking for a favor. He was sacrificing a pawn to save his king. "If you do not do this," Richard threatened, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "I will throw you out on the street tonight. No money, no clothes, no name. You will starve in the gutter. But if you take this charge, I will make sure you are taken care of when you get out." I was 17, I was scared, and I believed him. So when the police cruiser screeched to a halt and the officers stepped out with their flashlights drawn, I did not point at Preston. I stepped forward. I raised my hands. I let them handcuff me while my father put a protective arm around Preston and drove him home to a warm bed. I went to a detention center for 18 months. Preston went to a private academy. That was the deal. And today I am here to collect the payment with interest. But we are skipping the most important part of the story, Richard. The part where I hesitated. You see, before I agreed to ruin my life for Preston, I actually tried to say no. I was naive enough to think that my human rights mattered more than your reputation. And do you remember how you convinced me? You did not use logic. You used a chain. I looked at Keisha, who was now trembling visibly. Her legal mind was trying to process the fact that her father-in-law was not just a white-collar criminal, but a monster. He dragged me out to the yard in the middle of that storm, I told her, my voice devoid of emotion. He shackled me to the doghouse with a rusted iron chain. He told me that if I wanted to be a stubborn animal, I would live like one. And then he went inside and locked the door. For the first 24 hours, I thought it was a bluff. I thought someone would come out with a blanket or a sandwich. But nobody came. I shivered in the freezing mud watching the warm glow of the kitchen window where you all sat eating dinner. By the second day, the hunger was a physical pain like a knife twisting in my gut. I screamed for help until my voice gave out. I banged on the back door until my knuckles bled. But you turned up the volume on the television so the neighbors would not hear me. And then came the third day. That was the day I broke. That was the day the housekeeper brought out a bowl of premium beef stew for the German Shepherd. I watched the dog eat. I watched the steam rising from the bowl carrying the smell of meat and gravy. When the dog was finished, he left a few soggy crusts of bread in the mud. I paused, letting the image sink in. Richard was staring at the floor, his face gray. I was so hungry that I lost my humanity. I crawled on my hands and knees through the filth. I fought the dog for those scraps. I ate mud-covered bread that had been in a dog's mouth just to stop the pain in my stomach. And as I swallowed that degradation, I saw you, Richard. You were standing on the patio smoking a cigar, watching me with pure disgust. You said that once I signed the confession, I could have a real meal. That was the moment Ethan Cole died and Cerberus was born. I did not sign that paper because I loved Preston. I signed it because I wanted to live long enough to destroy you. I swore on that muddy bread that one day I would buy this house, and I would treat you exactly the way you treated me. I looked at Keisha again. That is the family you married into. That is the legacy you are protecting. A man who tortured his teenage son into a false confession to save his golden child. So tell me, counselor, does that sound like a case you want to defend, or does it sound like evidence you want to use? The elevator ride down from the Cerberus Tower was silent, but the air was thick enough to choke on. Preston was huddled in the corner of the car, wiping his nose with a silk handkerchief, mumbling about how unfair his life was. Richard stood like a statue, his eyes dead and hollow. I looked at the two men I had tied my life to, and for the first time I saw them clearly. They were not titans of industry. They were not powerful. They were a sinking ship, and I was the anchor they were dragging down with them. As soon as we returned to the penthouse, I did not go to the bedroom to comfort my sobbing husband. I went straight to my home office and locked the door. I needed to see the damage. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I opened the private safe behind the painting, pulling out the tax returns and financial statements for Cole Real Estate from the last 5 years. I spread the documents out on my mahogany desk, my lawyer brain taking over. I scanned the lines looking for the discrepancies that Richard had always waved away as creative accounting. But now, with the threat of Ethan looming over us, the numbers told a different story. It was not creative, it was criminal. There were assets listed that had been sold years ago. There were loans classified as revenue. There were millions of dollars in offshore accounts that were not being reported to the IRS. Richard had been cooking the books for a decade to maintain the illusion of wealth. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. This was fraud on a massive scale. But then my heart stopped. I turned the page to the legal attestation section of the previous year's filing. There at the bottom of the page in blue ink was a signature, Keisha Vance Cole. The room started to spin. I remembered that day. Richard had rushed into my office saying he needed a quick signature for a routine filing so he could secure a bridge loan. He had told me it was standard procedure. He had rushed me. And I, because I wanted to be the perfect daughter-in-law, because I wanted to prove I belonged in this family, had signed it without reading the fine print. I dropped the paper as if it were burning my fingers. I was not just a witness to their crimes. I was an accomplice. If Ethan handed these documents over to the authorities, I would not just lose my house. I would lose my law license. I would be disbarred. I could go to federal prison for aiding and abetting tax fraud. From the living room, I could hear Preston screaming at the television, probably watching the news reports about his family collapsing. He was useless. He would trade me in a heartbeat to save his own skin. And Richard had already proven he would sacrifice a son, so a daughter-in-law meant nothing to him. I sat back in my chair, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I was trapped. Unless. I looked at the documents again. I looked at the undeniable proof of Richard's guilt. Ethan wanted justice. He wanted to destroy his father. I was the only one who held the smoking gun that could finish the job legally. A plan began to form in my mind. It was cold and it was ruthless, but it was the only way out. I picked up my phone and stared at it for a long moment. I did not call Preston. I did not call Richard. I opened my contacts and searched for a number I had seen on the business card Ethan had left on the conference table. Survival is not about loyalty. It is about knowing when to jump ship. The jazz bar in Tribeca was dark enough to hide my identity and loud enough to mask a treasonous conversation. I checked my phone one last time to make sure Preston was not tracking my location. He was currently too busy drowning his sorrows in a bottle of scotch to notice his wife slipping out the back door. I walked to the corner booth where Ethan was waiting. He looked perfectly at ease, nursing a glass of amber liquid that probably cost more than my first car. He did not stand up when I approached. He simply gestured to the empty seat opposite him. "You took a risk coming here, Keisha," he said, his voice smooth and devoid of any brotherly affection. "If Richard finds out you are talking to the enemy, he will cut you out of the will before you can blink." I sat down, placing my leather tote bag on the table with a heavy thud. The sound was significant. It was the sound of leverage. "There is no will, Ethan," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "We both know that. The company is bankrupt. The house is mortgaged to the hilt. And Richard is a fraud. I am not here to save them. I am here to save myself." Ethan took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was listening. "I know you want to destroy them," I continued, keeping my voice low. "You want to see them lose everything. But you are missing the final nail in the coffin. You can take the house, but Richard will just claim bankruptcy and hide his assets. He will survive, he always does. Unless you have this." I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick manila envelope I had stolen from the safe. I slid it across the polished wood table. Ethan looked at it but did not touch it. "What is it?" he asked. "It is the shadow ledger," I whispered. "Richard has been funneling company profits into offshore shell companies for a decade to avoid taxes. He falsified income statements to get loans, and he hid revenue to avoid paying dividends. It is federal tax fraud, Ethan. It is grand larceny. It is 10 to 20 years in prison." Ethan finally reached out and opened the flap. He pulled out a few pages, his eyes scanning the numbers. A slow, cold smile spread across his face. This was the nuclear option he had been looking for. "But there is a problem," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Richard tricked me. He slipped some of these documents into a stack of routine legal filings. My signature is on them as legal counsel. If this goes public, I lose my license. I go to jail with him. I leaned forward, desperation clawing at my throat. "I will give you the originals. I will testify against him. I will give you everything you need to bury him in Preston. But you have to protect me. I want immunity. I want my name redacted from the public filing. I want to walk away from this marriage with my freedom and my career intact. That is the deal." Ethan looked at the documents, then at me. He was weighing the value of my betrayal against his desire for total vengeance. He knew that without my testimony, Richard might wiggle out of the fraud charges by blaming an accountant. With me, Richard was dead in the water. He slid the documents back into the envelope, and placed his hand over it, claiming ownership. "Done," he said. "I will have my lawyers draft a whistleblower agreement. You will be protected. But I have one condition. Anything." I breathed a sigh of relief. "You cannot tell them. You cannot give Preston a heads up. You cannot warn Richard. You have to go back to that house and play the role of the loyal wife. You have to let them believe they have a fighting chance until the gavel bangs at the auction. I want the look on their faces to be genuine when the floor drops out from under them. Can you do that?" I thought about Preston screaming at me. I thought about Richard using me as a scapegoat. I looked at Ethan and nodded. "Watch me," I said. Preston did not take the news well. While Keisha was making a deal to save her own skin, my brother was busy making the biggest mistake of his life. He was not smart enough to fight me in a boardroom, and he was too cowardly to fight me man to man. So he did what he always did. He used his father's money to pay someone else to do his dirty work. I was sitting in the back of my Rolls-Royce watching the city blur by when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my home security system, motion detected in the penthouse. I tapped the screen and brought up the live feed. 3 men wearing ski masks were currently smashing my living room to pieces. They were taking baseball bats to the 60-inch television, overturning the imported Italian sofa and shattering the glass display cases that held my vintage watch collection. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt at intimidation. They were not professionals. They were hired muscle looking for a quick payday. As I watched one of them spray paint the word traitor on my wall, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Preston's number. I answered, putting it on speaker so the hum of the engine wouldn't drown out his panic. "Hello, Preston," I said calmly. "I see you sent a welcoming committee. You are watching." Preston laughed, a high-pitched manic sound that bordered on hysteria. "Good. I wanted you to see it. I wanted you to see what happens when you mess with the Cole family." I watched on the screen as one of the thugs smashed a vase that looked suspiciously like the one Richard had accused me of breaking 15 years ago. The irony was palpable. "You are destroying property, Preston," I said. "That is another felony to add to your list. Do you really want to dig this hole deeper?" "I do not care about felonies," Preston screamed. "You think you can blackmail me? You think you can send me to jail for something that happened when I was a kid? You are wrong. This is your only warning, Ethan. Withdraw the foreclosure, tear up that confession deal, or the next time those guys come visit, you will be home." He paused, breathing heavily into the phone. "I made you disappear 15 years ago, Ethan. I can make you disappear again, permanently." I signaled my driver to pull over. I looked at the screen, watching the thugs high-five each other after destroying a painting. Preston thought he was displaying power. He thought he was the mob boss ordering a hit. He did not realize that he had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to destroy his public image forever. "You are right, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You have my attention. But you forgot one thing about modern penthouses. They are smart homes." I hung up the phone. I did not call the police. Not yet. Instead, I opened the app that controlled the building's media interface. I selected the live feed from my living room. Then I opened my social media accounts. The official Cerberus Capital page had 2 million followers. My personal account had another million. I typed a simple caption: "The desperate acts of a guilty man. Preston Cole sends his regards." Then I hit the button that said "Go Live." The livestream feed on my phone screen was crisp and clear, broadcasting in 4K resolution to millions of viewers. I watched comfortably from the leather seat of my Rolls-Royce as the 3 men destroyed my living room. They were not just breaking furniture. They were dismantling their employer's life, one swing of a baseball bat at a time. The view count in the corner of the screen ticked upward at a dizzying speed. 5,000, 50,000, 200,000. One of the thugs, a large man wearing a black hoodie, grabbed a bottle of scotch from my bar. He smashed it against the wall, the amber liquid splashing over my framed degree from Harvard. He turned to the hidden camera lens, unaware that he was staring into the eyes of the entire internet. "This is what happens when you mess with the family," he shouted, his voice distorted by the ski mask but still audible. Preston Cole sends his regards, you rat. Next time we break your legs, not just your furniture. I smiled. There it was, the golden ticket. He had named his client. He had turned a simple case of vandalism into a conspiracy. The comment section exploded. People were tagging the NYPD, they were tagging the FBI, and they were tagging major news outlets. The hashtag Justice for Ethan started trending worldwide within minutes. I did not feel angry about the damage. The furniture was insured. The art was insured. But the reputation of the Cole family was about to be damaged beyond repair, and no insurance company in the world would cover that. I watched as another thug overturned my coffee table, screaming Preston's name again like a battle cry. They thought they were terrifying me. In reality, they were auditioning for prison. My phone started buzzing with incoming calls. Reporters, investors, even the police commissioner. I ignored them all. I wanted the show to run its course. I wanted the world to see the raw, unfiltered violence that my brother was capable of. This was not just a home invasion. It was a character assassination, and Preston was holding the gun to his own head. The thugs finally finished their rampage, leaving my penthouse in ruins. As they climbed out of the window, escaping down the fire escape, they had no idea that their getaway car was already being tracked by a drone I had deployed minutes ago. I took a sip of water and tapped the screen, ending the broadcast. The video was automatically saved to the cloud and sent to my legal team and the district attorney. I leaned forward to the partition. Driver, take me to the precinct. I have a crime to report. And I brought the evidence. The car made a smooth U-turn. I looked out at the city lights, knowing that somewhere in a mansion across town, Preston was probably celebrating his victory. He did not know that his victory parade was actually a funeral procession. The internet never forgets. And tonight it had just learned his name. By the time the police arrived at my penthouse to take my statement, the damage to the Cole legacy was already terminal. I sat in the precinct giving my report, but my eyes were glued to the financial news playing on the lobby television. The ticker at the bottom of the screen told the story better than any headline could. Cole Real Estate Group down 40% in after-hours trading. The video of Preston's thugs destroying my home had gone from a viral moment to a corporate death sentence. Wall Street runs on confidence, and nothing kills confidence faster than a scandal involving violence and the chairman's family. Investors do not like instability. They certainly do not like it when the heir to the empire is caught on tape ordering a hit on a creditor. My phone buzzed with alert after alert. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Major partners were pulling out of development deals in Chicago and Miami. The rats were not just leaving the ship, they were setting it on fire on their way out. Back at the mansion, Richard was watching the same news. According to the housekeeper, he turned as white as a sheet when the anchor described Preston as a person of interest in a conspiracy investigation. Richard tried to stand up to answer the relentless ringing of the landline, but his legs gave out. The stress of $15 million in debt combined with the public humiliation finally squeezed his heart. He collapsed onto the Persian rug, clutching his chest and gasping for air. The paramedics were called, but Richard Cole was a stubborn man. When they arrived, he refused to get on the stretcher. He sat there in his silk robe, sweating profusely and shaking popping nitroglycerin pills like candy. He pushed the EMTs away, screaming that he was fine and that he had a company to save. He dragged himself back to his desk, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold the phone. He spent the next 3 hours making desperate calls. He pleaded with the bank to freeze the stock trading. He begged his oldest allies to issue statements of support. But nobody answered. He was toxic. He was radioactive. The man who had once commanded respect was now shouting into a void while his heart stuttered in his chest. He did not realize that there was nothing left to save. He was trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon while the water rose around his neck. I watched the stock price hit a 10-year low and felt a cold sense of satisfaction. This was the moment I had waited for. The collapse of his reputation was far more damaging than the foreclosure of his house. He had spent his life worshipping money and status above his own children. Now the money was gone, and his status was destroyed. I signed the police report and walked out of the precinct into the cool night air. The empire had fallen. Now it was time to pick over the carcass. The 30-day grace period evaporated like water on hot asphalt. I sat in my office watching the countdown clock on my monitor hit 0. There was no wire transfer from Richard Cole. There was no miracle investor. There was only silence. I picked up the phone and gave the order to execute the judgment. It was time to foreclose. At the mansion, Richard was pacing the hallway, wearing the same clothes he had worn yesterday. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. When the intercom buzzed, he jumped. He thought it might be a savior. Instead, it was the sound of reality crashing through his gates. A fleet of black SUVs accompanied by the county sheriff rolled up the long driveway. They did not knock. They pounded on the heavy oak door with the authority of the law behind them. Richard opened the door trembling. The lead deputy handed him a thick stack of papers. These were not warnings. They were eviction orders. "Mr. Cole," the officer said, his voice flat and professional. "This property is now under the jurisdiction of the bank. You have been served with a notice of default. We are here to inventory the assets and secure the premises for public auction." Richard tried to argue. He tried to explain that he was just waiting for a check to clear. He tried to use his old influence, threatening to call the mayor and the governor. But the officer just looked at him with pity. "Sir, the bank has accelerated the debt. Unless you have a cashier check for $15 million right now, you need to step aside." They moved past him like a tide. Men in suits started tagging the furniture with barcodes. They placed stickers on the paintings, the sculptures, and even the grand piano. Every item that Richard had used to define his worth was now just a lot number in a catalog. They walked through the house with clipboards, assessing the value of his life and finding it wanting. The final blow came when they walked out to the front gate. I watched via the security cameras as they hammered a large sign into the manicured lawn. It was bright orange and impossible to miss. Foreclosure auction. To be sold to the highest bidder. Date immediate. Neighbors drove by, slowing down to gawk at the sign. The humiliation was total. Richard stood by the window watching the sign being hammered into the ground. Each strike of the hammer felt like a nail in his coffin. He realized then that I had not given him 30 days to save his house. I had given him 30 days to realize that he never really owned it. The auction was set for Friday. The sharks were already circling, but they did not know that the biggest predator was already inside the tank waiting to swallow them whole. Richard Cole spent the final 48 hours before the auction burning down his own legacy to save the ashes. He was a man possessed, driven by the singular, terrifying thought of losing his status. He set up a command center in a small rental office, having been barred from his own company headquarters. With a phone in one hand and a bottle of scotch in the other, he began the fire sale. He called every broker he knew, offering up the few assets that were not yet entangled in the Cerberus debt web. He sold a strip mall in Jersey for half its value. He liquidated his stock portfolio, taking a massive loss just to get the liquidity. He even sold the vacation cabin in the Catskills, a property that had been in his family for 3 generations. He did not care about heritage anymore. He only cared about survival. But it was not enough. The numbers on his legal pad only added up to $4 million. He needed more. He needed a war chest that could scare away any potential bidders. His eyes turned to the leather jewelry case that Patricia had managed to smuggle out of the mansion before the eviction. The confrontation in their hotel room was ugly. Patricia tried to shield the case with her body, screaming that the diamonds were her insurance policy, her only safety net. Richard did not listen. He was past the point of negotiation. He physically wrestled the box from her hands, ignoring her manicured nails, clawing at his arms. "I bought these!" Richard shouted, his face purple with exertion. "I paid for every single carat, Patricia. They belong to me, and right now, they are the only thing standing between us and homelessness." He took the collection to a high-end fence in the Diamond District, a man who asked no questions and paid in cash. The humiliation of watching his wife's necklaces and rings being weighed on a scale like scrap metal was intense, but Richard swallowed it. He walked out of the back room with a heavy duffel bag and a hollow feeling in his chest. By the morning of the auction, he had scraped together $6.2 million. It was less than half of what the house was worth on paper, but Richard had convinced himself it was enough. He told himself that the foreclosure market was soft. He reasoned that serious investors would be scared off by the legal drama and the rumors of corruption. He believed that most people would assume the house came with too much baggage. He sat in his car outside the auction house, counting the cashier checks with trembling fingers. $6 million was a fortune to most people, but to him, it was a final, desperate gamble. He adjusted his tie, looking in the rearview mirror. He looked aged 10 years in the last week, but his eyes held a glimmer of delusional hope. He told himself that he was Richard Cole. He was a survivor. He would walk into that room, place the winning bid, and reclaim his throne. He had no idea that he was bringing a knife to a nuclear war. The auction house was a theater of cruelty disguised as a ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, illuminating the rows of velvet chairs, where vultures in expensive suits waited to pick the meat off the bones of the bankrupt. Richard Cole sat in the third row, clutching paddle number 402 like it was a holy relic. His knuckles were white and beads of sweat were already forming on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. Next to him, Patricia sat with her arms crossed, her neck bare where her diamond necklace used to be. She was muttering under her breath, a constant stream of venom directed at the man who had reduced her to a spectator in her own tragedy. "Do not screw this up, Richard," she hissed without looking at him. "If we end up in a rental apartment because you were too cheap to bid high enough, I swear I will file for divorce before the ink is dry." Richard ignored her, focusing on the room. It was packed. He had expected a quiet affair, a few bottom feeders looking for a bargain. Instead, the room was filled with aggressive-looking men, whispering into phones and checking tablets. He did not know that I had leaked the auction details to every major developer in the tri-state area. He did not know that half the people in the room were there because I wanted them there to drive the price up. He thought he was fighting for his home. He was actually stepping into a shark tank wearing a suit made of raw meat. The auctioneer, a British man with a voice as crisp as a new banknote, took the podium. The room fell silent. Behind him, a massive screen displayed a drone shot of the Cole mansion. It looked majestic, golden, and completely out of Richard's reach. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here to sell the property located at 12 Oak Ridge Drive," the auctioneer announced. "This is a foreclosure sale subject to immediate payment. We have verified funds from all registered bidders. Let us begin." Richard wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers. He checked the pocket of his jacket where the cashier checks totaling $6.2 million were sitting. It was everything he had left. It had to be enough. He told himself that nobody pays full market value at a foreclosure. He told himself he could steal it back for pennies on the dollar. He was about to learn that hope is a dangerous thing when you are playing against a man who holds all the cards. The auctioneer cleared his throat and the room fell instantly silent. The screen behind him displayed the aerial footage of the Cole estate, looking like a golden fortress that Richard was currently locked out of. "We will open the bidding at $4 million. Do I hear $4 million?" It was a low starting number designed to lure the sharks into the water. Richard felt a surge of adrenaline. $4 million was manageable. He raised his paddle number 402 with a shaky hand, but before the auctioneer could even point to him, a paddle shot up in the front row. $5 million. The bid came from a man in a sharkskin suit who Richard recognized as a ruthless developer from New Jersey. The price had just jumped $1 million in less than 10 seconds. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. This was not going to be the slow negotiation he had prayed for. This was a feeding frenzy. Richard grit his teeth and thrust his paddle into the air again. $5.5 million. He shouted, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. He needed to show strength. He needed to intimidate them. He looked at the developer, expecting him to back down. But the developer did not even turn around. Then a new player entered the game. From the back of the room, a woman speaking into a headset raised her finger. $6 million. She was a proxy bidder, likely representing a foreign conglomerate or a hedge fund. Richard felt a wave of nausea hit him. $6 million. He had liquidated everything he owned to scrape together $6.2 million. If he bid again, he would be leaving himself with zero margin for the buyer premium or the closing fees. He would technically be insolvent the moment the hammer fell. The auctioneer looked around the room, his rhythm unbreaking. I have 6 million to the lady in the back. Do I hear 6.2? 6 million going once. Richard looked at his phone sitting on his knee. On the screen was the contact for a hard money lender in Queens, a man who charged predatory interest rates and enforced payment with violence. It was a deal with the devil, but Richard saw no other choice. He could not let a stranger sleep in his bedroom. He could not let the world see him fail. Going twice at 6 million, the auctioneer chanted, raising the gavel. Richard jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. 6.2 million. He screamed, waving his paddle like a weapon. The entire room turned to stare at him. He was sweating profusely, his eyes wild and desperate. He looked less like a millionaire and more like a gambler at the end of a losing streak. Patricia put her head in her hands, unable to watch. Richard was breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had bid every single penny he had and money he did not yet have. He thought he had just made the winning move. He did not know he had just walked into the final trap. The auctioneer's hand was suspended in the air, holding the gavel like an executioner's axe. He took a deep breath, ready to finalize the sale that would save my father's reputation. Richard was practically vibrating in his seat, his eyes glued to that piece of wood. He had leveraged his entire life on this moment, believing that $6.2 million was enough to buy back his dignity. He was wrong. Just as the auctioneer's lips formed the word sold, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. I did not run in. I did not make a scene. I walked down the center aisle with the casual confidence of a man walking into his own living room. The click of my Italian leather shoes against the parquet floor was the only sound in the room. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wave. I could see the confusion on their faces. They recognized me from the news reports and the viral videos. They knew I was the son who had been cast out. I walked past the third row where Richard sat frozen. He looked at me, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He smelled like stale scotch and fear. I did not acknowledge him. I did not look at Patricia, who was staring at me as if I were a ghost come back to haunt her. I walked straight to the front row, to the single empty seat that had been reserved for a VIP bidder. I sat down, crossing my legs and adjusting my suit jacket. The auctioneer, who had been about to close the sale, lowered his gavel slowly. He looked at me and then at the registration list on his podium. He nodded once, acknowledging the player who had just entered the game. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out a bidding paddle. It was not a standard number. It was gold-plated. I raised it casually, not even bothering to look around. $15 million, I said, my voice calm and clear, cutting through the silence. Immediate cash payment. No contingencies. The room erupted. It was not just a gasp. It was a collective shockwave. 15 million was not just a bid. It was a statement. It was full market value plus a premium. It was a number that said, "This is not an auction. This is a hostile takeover." Richard jumped to his feet, knocking his chair over. "He does not have that kind of money," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the back of my head. "It is a lie. He is a fraud. Check his funds. Do not let him bid." The auctioneer did not look at Richard. He looked at me. "Mr. Cole's funds have been verified and secured in escrow," he announced, his voice cutting Richard off. "The bid stands at $15 million. Do I hear 16? Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. Nobody in that room was going to bid against a man who dropped $15 million without blinking. The sharks who had been circling earlier put their paddles down, knowing they had been outclassed. Richard stood there hyperventilating. He looked at the auctioneer, begging for time, begging for a miracle. But business is business, going once at 15 million. Richard slumped back against the wall. Going twice. I looked at the screen where the picture of the mansion was displayed. It looked beautiful. It looked expensive. It looked mine. Sold. The gavel came down with a thunderous crack that sounded like a gunshot ending Richard's life. Sold to Mr. Ethan Cole for $15 million. Congratulations, sir. The property is yours. The sound of the gavel striking the podium was the final note in the symphony of Richard Cole's destruction. The wood block cracked with a finality that seemed to physically strike him in the chest. For a moment, time seemed to suspend itself in the auction hall. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scratching of the auctioneer's pen as he recorded the sale. Then the reality rushed back into the room like a flood. Richard did not just react, he exploded. The veneer of the civilized businessman, the mask of the patriarch, the facade of the billionaire all shattered in a single instant. He let out a guttural roar that sounded more animal than human. He scrambled over the velvet rope that separated the bidders from the VIP section, his eyes bulging with a mixture of madness and tears. "You tricked me!" He screamed, his voice shredding his throat. "You gaffed the bid! You trapped me!" He charged down the center aisle, his arms flailing wildly. He was not looking at the security guards. He was not looking at the stunned crowd. He was looking only at me, sitting calmly in the front row. He wanted blood. He wanted to wrap his hands around my throat and squeeze until the nightmare ended. I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not even uncross my legs. I simply watched him come. Two men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows on either side of my chair. They were not hotel security. They were private contractors, former military men who moved with a terrifying efficiency. They did not draw weapons. They did not shout commands. They simply became a wall. Richard collided with them at full speed. It was like watching a bird fly into a pane of glass. One of the guards caught Richard's wrist in mid-swing, while the other placed a heavy hand on his chest. There was no struggle because there was no contest. With a simple, practiced motion, the guard twisted Richard's arm behind his back and swept his legs out from under him. My father hit the floor with a sickening thud. The air left his lungs in a wheezing gasp. His expensive suit, the armor he had worn to battle, was now twisted and stained with the dust of the floor. He tried to push himself up, but the guard's hand remained firmly on his shoulder, pinning him to the ground like an insect. "Let me go," Richard sobbed, his face pressed against the parquet floor. "It is my house. You cannot take it. It is mine." He began to weep. It was not a dignified silence. It was the ugly, messy crying of a man who has lost everything. Snot ran down his nose, mixing with the tears and the sweat. He pounded his free fist against the floorboards, a tantrum of pure impotence. The room watched in horrified fascination. This was the titan of real estate, the man who had terrorized boardrooms for 40 years, now lying in a heap at the feet of the son he had discarded. I stood up slowly, smoothing out a non-existent crease in my trousers. I looked down at him. From this angle, he looked incredibly small. "I did not trick you, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. "I simply played the game by your rules. You bet money you did not have on a future you do not own. That is not a trap. That is just bad business." I signaled to the guards. They hauled him to his feet, but his legs would not hold him. He sagged between them, a broken man being dragged out of his own life. As they escorted him toward the exit, the crowd parted, instantly terrified of catching the contagion of his failure. Richard Cole was no longer a man to be feared. He was a cautionary tale. The auctioneer placed the heavy document on the mahogany table with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts. It was the deed to the Cole estate, the physical manifestation of my father's empire. I picked up the fountain pen. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and cold in my hand. The room was so quiet, I could hear the scratch of the nib against the paper as I signed my name. With 4 quick strokes, the house, the grounds, the stables, and the legacy were transferred from Richard Cole to Ethan Cole. I capped the pen and handed the document back to the auctioneer. Done. The legal transfer was instantaneous. I was no longer the outcast son. I was the landlord. I turned slowly to face the side of the room where the security guards had allowed Richard to stand up. He was leaning against the wall, his face a mask of shock clutching his chest. He looked like a man who had just watched his own autopsy. I walked toward him, stopping just outside of striking distance. My guards tensed, ready to intercept, but I waved them off. Richard had no fight left in him. "You have a timeline, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He looked up, his eyes unfocused. "What?" he croaked. I checked the Patek Philippe on my wrist. It is currently 10:15. You have exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises. That means you need to be off the property by 12:15. At 12:16 you are trespassing. Richard blinked, trying to process the words. But my things. I need to pack. A house that size. It will take weeks. You are not listening. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he and the nearby sharks could hear. You are not packing the house. The auction included all fixtures, fittings, and furnishings. That means the furniture stays, the art on the walls stays, the rugs stay, the silverware stays. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. He was doing the math in his head and realizing the answer was 0. You can take your clothes. I continued ticking the items off on my fingers. You can take your personal toiletries. You can take family photographs, though I doubt you have any that include me. Anything else is theft of my property, and I will have you arrested. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. But where will I sleep? My bed? I cut him off cold. Your bed is a piece of furniture, Richard. It is a California king with a custom mahogany frame. It is listed on the inventory schedule as item number 400. It belongs to me. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the grave. The bed you sleep in is mine. The roof over your head is mine. The ground you are standing on is mine. You have 1 hour and 58 minutes to grab your suits and get out. If you are still there when my team arrives, I will have you removed by the sheriff. I turned my back on him, signaling to my driver that we were leaving. Do not be late, Richard, I called over my shoulder. I have a cleaning crew coming at 1. I would hate for them to sweep you out with the trash. The heavy iron gate swung shut with a clang that echoed like a prison door closing. It was 12:15 exactly. The sheriff did not offer a polite nod or a word of sympathy. He simply looped the heavy steel chain through the ornate bars and snapped the padlock shut. Click. The sound signaled the end of the Cole dynasty. Richard stood on the wet pavement staring at the lock. He was not wearing his Italian loafers. In the frantic rush to vacate, he had slipped on a pair of old sneakers. Beside him, Patricia shivered in her trench coat, clutching 2 heavy-duty black garbage bags to her chest. The irony was visual and brutal. The woman who had once refused to travel without her Louis Vuitton luggage set was now standing on the street corner holding her wardrobe in plastic trash sacks. We had to leave the suitcases behind because technically they were listed as household containers on the asset schedule. I was very specific about the rules. If it was not cloth and it was not on your back, it stayed in the house. So there they stood, looking like refugees from a disaster movie, rather than the royalty of Greenwich, Connecticut. Then came the rain. It started as a few cold drops hitting the asphalt, then intensified into a steady, freezing downpour. It was poetic justice written in water. 15 years ago, Richard had dragged me out into a storm just like this one. He had watched me shiver in the mud while he stayed warm and dry behind the glass. Now the universe was returning the favor with interest. The water soaked through Richard's thin shirt, plastering it to his skin. It ruined Patricia's expensive blowout within seconds, turning her hair into stringy, wet ropes that plastered to her face. Mascara ran down her cheeks like black tears. The street remained quiet, but it was the silence of an audience holding its breath. Across the road, curtains twitched in the windows of the neighboring mansions. These were the people Richard had hosted at galas. These were the people Patricia had judged for wearing last season's fashion. Now they were watching. A black Range Rover drove by at a crawl, the tinted window rolling down just an inch so the occupant could snap a photo with their phone. Preston kicked one of the trash bags in frustration, splitting the plastic. A pile of designer silk shirts spilled out onto the muddy sidewalk, getting soaked instantly. "This is humiliating," Preston screamed, his voice cracking. "Call the driver, Dad! Where is the limo? Why are we standing here like beggars?" Richard did not answer. He was staring at the house, at the warm glow of the lights in the foyer that he had paid for but could no longer enjoy. "There is no limo, you idiot," Richard whispered, his voice hollow. "The company cars were seized this morning. The accounts are frozen. We do not have a driver." Then what do we do? Preston shouted. It is raining. I am cold. Fix this. Richard turned slowly to look at his son. For the first time, he saw Preston not as a golden child, but as a 30-year-old man who could not even hail a taxi. We walk, Richard said. We walk until we find a bus stop. He picked up his garbage bag of clothes, slung it over his shoulder, and began to trudge down the hill. He did not look back. He knew that if he turned around, he would see me standing in the window watching him drown. The procession of misery did not make it far down the hill before the final link in the family chain snapped. Patricia stopped walking. Her Italian heels had sunk into the soft mud of the road shoulder, and the expensive leather was ruined. She looked down at her feet, then at the soaked garbage bag she was clutching, and finally at Richard's hunched back. The reality of the situation had pierced through her denial. There would be no miracle. There would be no last-minute rescue. There was only the rain, the cold, and a husband who had failed to maintain the one thing she valued above all else, his utility. Richard stopped when he realized she was no longer following him. He turned around, wiping the rain from his eyes. "Come on, Patricia," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of cold and fear. "The bus stop is only another half-mile. We can get a room at a motel near the airport. We will figure this out. We just need to stick together." Patricia dropped her garbage bag. It hit the wet pavement with a heavy wet thud. She did not look at the bag. She looked at Richard with eyes that were harder than the diamonds she had forced him to sell. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed in the twilight, illuminating a face that had twisted into a mask of pure disgust. "I am not going to a motel, Richard," she said, her voice flat and deadly calm. "And I am certainly not getting on a bus. I have never been on a bus in my life, and I do not intend to start now." She tapped the screen, confirming a ride on a luxury car service app. She had kept a separate credit card, hidden one that Richard did not know about, linked to a bank account she had maintained under her maiden name for emergencies. This was an emergency. Richard stared at her, confusion clouding his mind. "What are you doing? We have to stay together. You are my wife." "I was your wife when you were a billionaire," Patricia corrected him. "I was your wife when you provided a penthouse and a summer home and a staff of 5. That was the agreement, Richard. You provide the lifestyle and I play the part of the trophy. But looking at you now, standing in the rain with a trash bag, you are not a trophy husband. You are a liability." Headlights cut through the gloom. A black sedan, not a limousine, but a clean, dry, respectable town car pulled up beside them. The driver cracked the window, looking for his passenger. Patricia stepped toward the car, ignoring Preston, who was watching his mother with his mouth open. She grabbed the door handle and paused, looking back at Richard one last time. "I cannot live like this." She spat the words out like poison. "I refuse to be poor, Richard. It is ugly, and it smells. You were supposed to be a titan. You were supposed to be a winner. But look at you. You let your own son outsmart you. You lost the house, you lost the money, you lost the status." She opened the car door, the warm, dry interior beckoning like heaven. "You are useless to me now," she said. She slid into the leather seat and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed in the empty street. The car pulled away, spraying a fan of muddy water onto Richard's trousers. He stood there frozen, watching the taillights disappear into the mist. He was alone. His empire was gone. His home was gone. And now the woman he had bought with his fortune had just returned him like a defective product. The taillights of Patricia's escape vehicle faded into the mist, leaving Richard and Preston standing in a silence that was louder than the storm. The rain had turned torrential, soaking through their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Preston was shivering violently, but it was not just from the cold. It was the shock of abandonment. For 30 years he had been the center of the universe, protected by his father's money and his mother's fierce social climbing. Now he was just a man, standing in the mud wearing a ruined suit. He turned to Richard, his face a mask of panic. "Dad, we have to do something. Call the lawyer, call the mayor. You cannot just let her leave. You cannot let us stand here like this." Richard did not answer. He was staring at the spot where his wife had stood, realizing that his entire life had been a transaction and his credit had just been declined. He gripped the neck of the black garbage bag so tight his knuckles turned white. He was trying to formulate a plan, but his mind was a blank slate. There were no more moves to make on the chessboard. The king had fallen. Then came the sound. At first, it was a low wail in the distance, rising and falling on the wind. Then it grew sharper, more urgent. Blue and red lights began to bounce off the wet asphalt, flickering against the stone walls of the estate like a strobe light in a horror movie. Preston's face lit up with a desperate, delusional hope. "It is the police," he shouted, pointing down the road. "Finally. You called them right, Dad. You called them to arrest Ethan. You told them he stole the house. They are here to help us. They are here to kick him out and let us back in." Richard looked up slowly. He knew better. He knew the difference between a courtesy call and a raid. The vehicles that rounded the corner were not coming to offer assistance. They were coming to clean up the mess. 3 squad cars screeched to a halt in front of the gate, boxing in the 2 men. The doors flew open in unison, and officers stepped out into the rain. They did not look friendly. They did not have the deferential demeanor that the local police usually reserved for the Cole family. These were city cops, hardened and serious. Their hands hovered near their holsters. One of them, a sergeant with a jaw like granite, stepped forward. He ignored Richard completely. His eyes were locked on Preston. "Preston Cole!" He barked, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "Step forward and keep your hands where I can see them." Preston blinked, the smile freezing on his face. "Me? Why are you talking to me? My brother is the one inside. He is the thief. You need to go in there and arrest him. I am the victim here." The sergeant did not blink. He walked up to Preston, closing the distance with an intimidating stride. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metal gleaming under the streetlights. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit criminal mischief and destruction of property related to the incident at the Millennium Tower earlier today. We have video evidence linking you to the perpetrators." Preston stumbled back, his shoes slipping in the mud. "That is a lie. I did not do anything. It was a prank. It was a misunderstanding. Dad, tell them. Tell them who I am." But the officer was not finished. He grabbed Preston's wrist, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency. The click of the handcuffs was sharp and final. Furthermore, the sergeant continued, his voice dropping an octave. "The district attorney has reopened the investigation into the death of Michael Henson on September 4th, 2009. The blood drained from Preston's face so fast he looked like a corpse. His knees buckled, and the officer had to hold him up to keep him from collapsing into the gutter. "What?" Preston whispered. "That case is closed. My brother confessed. You cannot do this. It is double jeopardy." "We have received new evidence," the officer said, tightening the cuffs, "including a sworn affidavit from a witness regarding the true driver of the vehicle. And we have recovered financial documents linking your father to the payoff of the original investigating officer." Preston's head snapped toward Richard. The betrayal was absolute. The secret they had buried for 15 years, the lie that had cost Ethan his youth and his freedom, had been dug up. Keisha. It had to be Keisha. She had given them everything. Preston began to struggle. The reality of prison, the reality of a life without luxury, crashed down on him. He was not going to a holding cell for a few hours. He was going away for a long time. "Dad," Preston screamed, his voice high and shrill. "Dad, do not let them take me. You promised. You said you fixed it. You said it was over. Do something. Pay them. Bribe them. Just get me out of this." Richard stood frozen just 5 feet away. The rain dripped from his nose and chin. He looked at his son, the boy he had sacrificed his morality to protect. He looked at the officers who viewed him not as a titan of industry, but as a pathetic old man in the rain. "I cannot," Richard whispered. The words were barely audible. "I have no money, Preston. I have no power. I cannot fix this." Preston's screaming intensified as the officers dragged him toward the patrol car. "You are useless, just like Mom said. You are nothing. Help me. Somebody help me." Richard watched as they shoved Preston into the back seat. The boy who had been given everything, who had never faced a consequence in his life, was now caged like an animal. Preston pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide with terror, mouthing the word "Dad" over and over again. The sergeant turned to Richard. "We will be coming for you next, Mr. Cole. Do not leave town. Not that you have anywhere to go." The officers got back into their cars. The engines roared to life. The caravan of justice pulled away, splashing mud onto Richard's legs. He stood there alone in the dark. The red taillights disappeared into the distance, taking his legacy with them. He looked up at the mansion. The lights in the master bedroom were on. He could imagine Ethan standing there watching the show. The transfer of power was complete. The king was dead, the prince was in chains, and the exile sat on the throne. Richard dropped the garbage bag. He did not have the strength to carry it anymore. He fell to his knees on the wet pavement, the cold seeping into his bones. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Only the rain answered him, washing away the last traces of the Cole family name from the earth. He was finally exactly where he had left Ethan 15 years ago, alone, cold, and hungry. The rain had turned the driveway into a river of black water reflecting the cold streetlights. Richard Cole remained on his knees, his expensive trousers soaking up the filth of the gutter. He was shivering so violently that his teeth clicked together in a frantic rhythm. He was 60 years old, and for the first time in 4 decades, he was completely and utterly exposed. There were no lawyers to shield him, no bank accounts to comfort him, no roof to protect him. He was just a biological organism, failing to cope with the elements. He looked up at the house. It loomed above him on the hill, a fortress of warmth and light. He could see the silhouette of the chandelier in the foyer, the same chandelier he had imported from France for $50,000. It mocked him. Everything he had built, everything he had stolen and cheated for was right there, yet it might as well have been on the moon. The sound of an electric motor cut through the noise of the storm. The massive iron gates, which had just slammed shut on his life, began to groan open again. They moved slowly, parting just enough to create a gap. Richard's heart leaped. A desperate, pathetic hope flared in his chest. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe Ethan had realized he had gone too far. Maybe there was still a shred of familial duty left in the boy's heart. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the gatehouse. It was not a servant. It was not a lawyer. It was Ethan. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit perfectly tailored and holding a large black umbrella that shielded him completely from the downpour. He stopped 3 feet away from Richard, his shoes dry and polished, contrasting sharply with Richard's ruin. Ethan looked down. His face was unreadable. There was no anger, no gloating, no triumph. There was only a terrifying indifference. He looked at Richard the way a scientist might look at a specimen in a jar. Richard scrambled to get up, slipping in the mud before managing to stand on shaky legs. He wiped the rain from his eyes, trying to summon some semblance of dignity. But his voice betrayed him. It came out as a broken whisper. "Ethan, please. It is freezing. I have nowhere to go." Patricia took the last of the cash. "Preston is..." "They took Preston. I am alone. You cannot leave me out here. I am your father." Ethan tilted his head slightly, the rain drumming a steady beat against the silk canopy of his umbrella. "I know exactly who you are, Richard. That is why we are standing here." He adjusted his cufflink, the diamond catching the stray light. "I am not here to offer you charity. Charity is for people who deserve it. I am here because I have a business proposition." Richard blinked, water dripping from his nose. "A proposition? What are you talking about?" "I have nothing left to trade. You took it all." "Not everything," Ethan corrected him smoothly. "You still have a pulse, and you have experience. You spent 40 years guarding this estate. You know every lock, every camera, every weakness in the perimeter. You were obsessed with keeping people out." Ethan paused, letting the silence stretch until Richard's shivering became audible again. "I fired the security team this morning. They were loyal to you, which means they are a liability to me. I need a new night watchman. Someone to man the gatehouse. Someone to walk the perimeter in the rain to make sure no intruders disturb the owner's sleep." Richard stared at him, his mouth falling open. "You want me to work for you?" As a guard. Ethan nodded once. The position pays $15 an hour, minimum wage. You will work from 8 in the evening until 6 in the morning, 7 days a week, no holidays. He pointed a gloved finger toward the small brick guard shack at the entrance of the driveway. It comes with accommodation. There is a cot in the back of the booth. It is small, but it is dry. And it has a heater. You will have a roof over your head, and you will earn enough to buy food. That is more than you gave me when you kicked me out. The humiliation hit Richard harder than the cold. He was being offered the lowest position on the property he had once ruled. He would be the servant opening the gate for the cars he used to own. He would be the one standing in the rain while Ethan slept in the master bedroom. I cannot. Richard stammered, his pride flaring up one last time like a dying ember. I am Richard Cole. I built this place. I will not be your servant. I will not be your dog. Ethan's expression did not change. He simply checked his watch. Then you are free to leave. The public park is 5 miles down the road. I hear the benches are quite comfortable if you cover yourself with newspapers. But I suggest you start walking now. Hypothermia sets in quickly at this temperature, especially for a man of your age. Ethan turned around, the heels of his shoes clicking on the wet pavement. He began to walk back toward the warmth of the mansion. Richard looked down the dark, empty road. The wind howled, cutting through his wet shirt like a knife. He imagined the park bench. He imagined freezing to death alone in the dark, an anonymous body found by a jogger in the morning. The fear of death finally strangled his pride. Wait! Richard screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. Wait! Ethan stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He let Richard stand there for 10 agonizing seconds, soaking in the reality of his submission. Then slowly he turned back. I accept. Richard whispered, his head bowing in defeat. I accept the job. Please, just let me inside. Ethan walked back toward him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass keyring. It held the keys to the pedestrian gate and the guard booth. The metal jingled softly, a sound Richard knew well. It was the sound of authority. 15 years ago, you threw a set of keys at me and told me to park your car. You told me that if I dropped them, I was not worth the food I ate. Do you remember that, Richard? Richard nodded, tears mixing with the rain on his cheeks. I remember. Ethan held the keys out. Richard reached for them, his hand trembling, desperate to clutch the lifeline. But Ethan did not hand them over. Just as Richard's fingers grazed the metal, Ethan opened his hand. The keys fell. They hit the muddy asphalt with a wet splash, landing in a puddle of dirty water right at Richard's feet. The gesture was a mirror image of the past, a perfect circle of karmic justice. Pick them up, Ethan said, his voice cold as the grave. Richard looked at the keys in the mud. Then he looked at Ethan. He realized then that this was not just a job offer. It was an execution. Ethan was killing the last remnant of Richard Cole, the billionaire. Slowly, painfully, Richard lowered himself. He got down on his hands and knees in the filth. The water soaked into his pants, cold and gritty. He reached into the puddle, his fingers closing around the cold brass. He clutched the keys tight, bringing them to his chest as he looked up at his son from the ground. Ethan looked down at him, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. Welcome to the staff, Richard. Don't fall asleep on the job. I dock pay for negligence. Ethan turned and walked through the gates, the umbrella shielding him from the storm. The heavy iron doors began to close again, but this time Richard was on the inside. He was safe from the rain, but he was trapped in a prison of his own making, clutching the keys to a kingdom that would never be his again. My fingers closed around the cold brass keys submerged in the puddle. The mud oozed between my manicured fingers, a tactile reminder of how low I had fallen. I did not stand up with dignity. I rose slowly, my knees popping, my expensive suit heavy with rainwater and filth. I looked for Ethan, hoping for a nod of acknowledgement, perhaps a shred of pity. But the driveway was empty. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion had already closed, sealing the warmth and the light inside, leaving me in the storm. I turned away from the main entrance and began the long walk to the perimeter. I knew exactly where he wanted me to go. He had not assigned me to the main gatehouse with its electric heater and cushioned chair. He had pointed toward the south corner of the estate, a neglected patch of land where the landscaping ended and the wild woods began. As I approached the structure, my stomach twisted. It was a small, dilapidated shed that had once been used to store fertilizer and rusted tools. But that was not its only history. Just a few feet away from the rotting door stood a concrete slab. I stared at it, the rain plastering my hair to my skull. That was where the doghouse used to be. That was where I had chained a 17-year-old boy in a thunderstorm because I valued my reputation more than his life. I unlocked the shed door. It swung open with a screech of rusted metal that sounded like a scream. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and damp earth. There was no insulation. The wind whistled through cracks in the wooden planks. The accommodation Ethan had promised was a lie. There was no cot. There was only a hard wooden chair sitting in the center of the room and a single bare light bulb dangling from the ceiling. I sat down on the chair. My wet trousers soaked the wood. I was shivering violently now, the hypothermia flirting with my extremities. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to preserve what little body heat remained. My stomach cramped with a hunger so sharp it felt like a physical blow. I had not eaten since the morning toast I left on my plate when the bank letter arrived. Through the single grime-streaked window, I looked up the hill. The mansion was blazing with light. Every room was illuminated from the grand ballroom to the master suite. It looked like a golden ocean liner sailing through the dark night. I could see the silhouette of a man standing in the window of the library. He was holding a glass, looking down at the darkness where I sat. He was drinking my cognac. He was standing on my Persian rug. He was living my life. And I was sitting in a shed that smelled of rot, guarding the very walls that kept me out. The irony was not lost on me. It was a surgical strike on my soul. Ethan had not just taken my wealth. He had engineered a perfect reversal of fate. I looked at the corner of the shed. There, sitting on a dusty shelf, was a small bowl. I stood up on shaky legs and walked over to it. It was an old dog bowl, chipped and faded. Inside was a single wrapped granola bar. I stared at it. It was the kind of cheap processed food I would never have allowed in my pantry. But as my stomach roared, I realized it was the most valuable thing I currently owned. I sat back down on the wooden chair, the wood biting into my spine. I peeled the wrapper with trembling fingers. As I took the first bite of the dry, tasteless bar, I kept my eyes fixed on the golden window of the mansion. I chewed slowly, swallowing the humiliation along with the food. The circle was complete. The master was now the dog, and the dog had become the master. And the night had only just begun. The fire in the limestone hearth crackled with a sound that felt like luxury itself. I stood in the center of the living room, the warmth seeping into my bones, a stark contrast to the freezing rain battering the windows. In my hand, I held a crystal snifter filled with Louis XIII cognac. It was a bottle Richard had bought 10 years ago, saving it for a special occasion. He had told me once that he would open it the day he made his first billion. He never got the chance. I took a slow sip, savoring the burn of the amber liquid. It tasted like victory. The room was bathed in a soft golden glow. The storm outside was just a backdrop now, a piece of theater playing out for my amusement. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, the glass cool against my fingertips. I looked down the long, winding driveway past the manicured hedges and the iron gates to the far corner of the estate. Through the driving rain, I could just make out the faint, pathetic light of the guard shack. It was a single yellow bulb swinging in the darkness, illuminating the rotting wood of the shed. I knew exactly what was happening inside that box. Richard Cole was sitting on a hard wooden chair, shivering in his wet clothes, staring at the walls of his new prison. He was probably eating the stale granola bar I had left him. He was probably thinking about the soft mattress in the master suite and the heated floors in the bathroom. I turned away from the window. I did not need to see him. Knowing he was there, cold and hungry, was enough. I walked back toward the fireplace. On the floor, resting on a plush velvet cushion that cost more than most people's cars, lay Buddy. my Doberman. He was not chained outside in the mud. He was not begging for scraps. He was stretched out on his side, his sleek black coat gleaming in the firelight. He was chasing rabbits in his dreams, his paws twitching slightly. He sensed my presence and opened one sleepy eye. He did not flinch. He did not cower. He let out a soft, contented sigh and thumped his tail lazily against the floor. He knew he was safe. He knew he was home. I knelt down beside him, placing my glass on the mahogany coffee table. I ran my hand over his smooth head, scratching him behind the ears just the way he liked. He leaned into my touch, trusting me completely. The irony was perfect. 15 years ago, my father had told me that the house was for humans and the dogs slept outside. He had dehumanized me to elevate himself. Now the roles were reversed. The man who had acted like a beast was in the cage, and the animal who offered unconditional loyalty was sleeping on velvet. "Sleep tight, buddy," I whispered, my voice soft in the quiet room. I looked one last time at the window where the darkness pressed against the glass. In this house, only the loyal ones get to be treated like people. I stood up and turned off the lamp, leaving the room illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire. The darkness swallowed the room, bringing a final peaceful silence to the Cole estate. Fade to black. The saga of the Cole family offers a brutal but necessary lesson on the nature of power, loyalty, and the cyclical nature of karma. The tragedy of Richard Cole was not that he lost his fortune, but that he lost his humanity long before the bank accounts ran dry. He spent a lifetime measuring worth by the balance in a ledger, believing that dignity was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and that cruelty was a right of the powerful. The story illustrates that when you build a life based on transactional relationships, you are destined for bankruptcy the moment the currency fails. Richard's wife and favorite son did not abandon him because of bad luck. They abandoned him because he had taught them that love is conditional on status. By dehumanizing Ethan, treating him like a dog to be chained and starved, Richard did not break his son. He forged him into a weapon. He created the very monster that would eventually devour his legacy. Ultimately, the narrative redefines the concept of civilization. The Coles in their silk suits and diamonds were the savages tearing each other apart for survival. Ethan, despite his ruthless methods, operated with a strict code of justice. The final image of the faithful dog sleeping by the fire, while the former master shivers in the shed, serves as a powerful metaphor. True nobility is not about pedigree or property, but about character. In the end, the universe balances the books. You cannot treat people like animals and expect them to show you humanity when the roles are reversed. If you enjoyed this saga of cold calculation and ultimate justice, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the next story of retribution.